Yeah, I got to go out to Idaho a bit when I was a kid, during the winter when Dad was doing these surveys. I remember bits and pieces. I wasn't actually, I was pretty small, so I wasn't actually like hiking, in the snow looking for ducks or anything. But I'd be like, back at the house where we were staying, um, and entertaining myself, middle of winter. A lot of the places we stayed on Idaho weren't always the warmest. They were sort of like summer cottages, so it was pretty cold, even if I stayed back at the house. Um, but yeah, I remember spending afternoons entertaining myself, and then Dad would get back and like, you know, be like, see any ducks, and you just, it's really cold work. That's my biggest takeaway from all the memories is just remembering how cold it is doing surveys out on, exposed coastline in the middle of winter. It's not for everybody.
Yeah. Did I ever drag you out to the south end to do a part of a survey, or do you have any memories of that? Like, I think I remember meeting you maybe in Deep Cove on one of the surveys as I was running past. Um, I thought I remembered you and Pepin came out with Dobby, but I don't know. Am I remembering that right, or do you have a memory of that?
Honestly, I don't have any specific memories. I do have memories of being out on Idaho in winter and trekking around in the snow. So that might have been it. That might have been when that was. There might have been a
Hmm.
four-wheeler involved. Can't remember if
Oh
it
yeah,
was winter. Yeah.
that's right. That's what the purple sandpiper research. The park let us use four-wheeler.
Yeah.
Huh.
I can butt in here with a memory. This is Dobby, Celeste's mom. Uh,
Yeah.
there was a time when you were banding Harlequins, Glen, and you had the floating platforms. You're going out in boats to to pick the Harlequins out of the floating mist nets.
Yeah.
And Celeste and Pepin and I and some other kids that lived out on Idaho went down to the south end, and you brought a Harlequin ashore in a boat with whoever you were working with, and we got to see it up close, in your lap, in your hands. I don't know if
Yeah.
you remember last.
I do remember that. It's a strong memory actually of like getting to see the ducks up close. That was really cool.
Yeah. No, I remember that as well. Now that you mention it. Yeah. And yeah, it is a big thing. I spent a decade watching like Harlequin ducks. I was studying it, for about 10 years. And then finally to get one in the hand, it really changes your experience with it. To see it up close, it's quite challenging, quite different to
Right.
finally see it up close. Yeah. Well, enough folks have probably trickled in, so we can go ahead with our talk. Any logistics we should mention first, Celeste? What you're recording this and
Yep, I'm recording this, and I think we had mentioned people may have questions about the expedition tomorrow. I think we're going to hold those questions till the end. But yeah, there'll be an opportunity to ask any and all questions related to that.
yeah, so if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll probably wait until I get through my slideshow and then Elliot, who's on the call, will uh, ask some of the questions, be reading through the questions and figure out which ones to ask um, related to the talk. And then once we're done with that, then we'll talk logistics for those of you who are going out in the boat tomorrow, um, just so everyone feels prepared for what to expect. So we'll end talking about the specifics of the boat trip tomorrow. So I have very fond memories of winter offshore work. Um, and when you get days like this where it's flat calm, you know, when you get days that are flat calm, they're going to be very cold. It's just the nature of the weather patterns. Um, but you learn how to dress, and these are gorgeous days to be on the water, but it doesn't always last like that. Later in the day, it might start out flat calm. The wind may pipe up. Things change quickly offshore in winter. The weather's not that great, but it is still very rewarding to work in these areas. And I've worked out off the coast for nearly 4 decades doing winter surveys. And for the most part, I've been studying, for most of this work, I've been studying two species. One is the Harlequin duck that winters off our coast, and the other is the purple sandpiper. And even though I was studying, the research focus was on those two species, um, on these surveys, I recorded everything I ran across, all the other species, because not a lot of people get offshore on some of these isolated ledges in winter. And I didn't think things would change population wise. I wasn't, I was in my 20s. I was starting my career, but I decided to record everything, and I'm glad I did because things do change. And, if you've been watching long enough, it's changes natural and normal in the environment. It's a little hard to watch when you've been uh, going to some of these sites for a long time. Sometimes it's hard to see the change that's happening. But I first wanted to talk a bit about the Harlequin duck. I get a lot of questions about this, and it's the species I've been studying the longest. So it's a species that winters in Maine, and it winters from the south coast of Newfoundland south through New Jersey and a little bit south. So it winters along this coast and breeds in Gaspé Peninsula and southern Quebec and Labrador. And some of the males actually do a migration to Greenland as well. So that's the stomping grounds. That's the normal travel route for the Harlequin ducks that we see on the Maine coast. And they breed on rivers, often fast moving, rapid sections because it's the first part of the river to ice out in the spring. And they winter in sites like this. This is the southern end of Idaho. It's very rocky, it's very exposed, lots of wave action. Um, and there's plenty of that on the Maine coast, actually. And when they do like to play in the surf. It's where they feed. That bird, that Harlequin duck there, isn't there by accident. He's been hanging out there the last half an hour, diving between waves. And when they go down in the water column, they pick off these amphipods, kind of shrimp-like things, and gastropods. This is Lacuna vincta, or chink shell, that are very small, just a couple millimeters long. So that's what they're feeding on when they're on their wintering grounds here on the Maine coast. And this was my my idea of what it was like to work on these offshore sites in winter, which is totally the case. I took this picture in 1988, December of 1988, when I first started work on Isla Ho. And yeah, it's can be a challenging time. It's, a gale with really cold, blowing big waves, lots of ice. Um, and this is, where the Harlequin ducks like to hang out. So over, the last nearly 4 decades, I've done 150 offshore winter surveys, chasing purple sandpipers and Harlequin ducks on a lot of the Maine coast. And I say approximately 150 because I'm still extracting data daily from my notebooks on these surveys. A lot of my original research was focused on Harlequin ducks and then later purple sandpipers. So all those numbers got extracted and pulled into reports and everything. And the data on all the other species just stayed in my field notebooks all these years. And now's a prime time to extract all of those data and figure out all the change that's happened. And there's a ton of data, hundreds of locations in winter, 150, days of surveying in winter offshore since 1989. And I was just doing a little data entry before the talk started, and I'm up to 7,000 records of these wintering species. And that number's still growing as I keep extracting those data. So the basic questions that you try to answer when doing a winter waterbird survey are rather basic. The tough part is getting out there, but if you pick your day right, isn't this a gorgeous day? And it's calm enough, you want to know what species winter here, which is fairly basic, and how many. I used to describe to my kids that I was a professional counter, which they got a kick out of. But counting is complex because the numbers can vary from day to day, or maybe from year to year. Maybe the numbers change. Individuals winter in different locations. Maybe they don't. Your detectability, are you detecting all the birds that are actually there? It gets complex to get an accurate number. And, birds can fly as well. If they fly, you count them here and they fly to an area that you haven't counted yet. It's like, oh, okay, I got to keep track of that. I don't want to double count those same individuals. So the counting is kind of complex on these surveys. So to jump to the conclusion for the Harlequin Duck surveys, this was in the 1990s. We estimated that 1,100 Harlequin ducks wintered on the Maine coast. And 50 of those birds wintered in York County, in the Cape Nettic area. Another 50 birds wintered on the Sally Islands area, which is off of Gouldsboro. And maybe a dozen harlequins wintered off of Cutler, and 1,000 birds wintered in a small section in the mid-coast, centered around Isle Ho. And it's actually a fairly discrete area. It's the southern end of Frenchboro, not quite getting to Swans Island, clipping the south end of Marshall Island, just the south end of Isle Ho, over to these islands south of Vinyl Haven. That's where those 1,000 birds were. And you get outside of that area by just a mile, and you wouldn't ever see any Harlequin ducks. They were that tied into that particular area. So that's definitely where a bulk of the Harlequin ducks wintered. Centered around Isle Ho, this area east of Isle Ho. And we did the same thing with purple sandpipers. I learned while doing all this work on Harlequin ducks, I kept seeing all these purple sandpipers, which are even smaller birds. It didn't make sense that they could survive in winter on these offshore sites. So I just became more curious about them as time went on. And we discovered that there was around 14 to 17,000 purple sandpipers wintering on the entire Maine coast. And I've zoomed in here to the same area. This is Mount Desert Island, Swans Island, Stonington, Vinyl Haven, Penobscot Bay is up here. And if you look at where the cluster of these red dots are, it's in that same area I was talking about for Harlequin ducks. So the core wintering area for purple sandpipers is really in this area east of Idaho as well. And so this area is figured prominently for two species. So just to make sure we're all oriented where this is, Mount Desert Island is up here, Bar Harbor, Swans Island, Stonington, the ferry runs to Idaho from Stonington, and that's Idaho down here. So this, the core area for Harlequins starts in the southern half of Idaho over towards Swans Island. So it's a small area. And I ran a ton of surveys of the Idaho shoreline. The nice thing about Idaho is I didn't need a boat to survey them. I caught a ride on the ferry out of Stonington that ran a few times a day, even in winter, and could hike out to the south end of Idaho and run the shoreline from Western Head over to Eastern Head, Sheep Thief Gulch area. It took most of the daylight hours to cover that thing, but I could count Harlequin ducks along the way, and I could do it in any weather pretty much. And I ran like 60 surveys of counts, individual counts of Harlequin ducks along that route over the years. So I got a really good handle on those numbers. And there was an average of 200 to 250 Harlequin ducks along the shore up through the 2000s. Didn't really vary that much. It's the largest wintering population on a single site in all of Eastern North America. So we've been running some surveys recently. Logan Parker, who's on this call, has been helping me out rerunning these using the exact same methods. I still have the exact same maps I used in the 80s and 90s. And we're actually using the same spotting scopes as well. It's just exact same methods. And there's been a 95% drop in the number of Harlequin ducks along this route. So this area that used to have 200 to 250 consistently in the winter, this winter, our high count has been around a dozen birds. So major population drop. And we're still teasing out exactly the reasons for this. It might have to do with some otter that are now quite common along this shoreline. There's a couple other things we're looking into as well. Don't have the answers yet. We just know that the population there has crashed, which puts this map into perspective. Like, okay, if a bulk of the birds winter in this Idaho area, and I just told you that at Idaho, the numbers have crashed. It's like, well, does that mean this 1,000 birds is now much lower? Is it 100? Is it what's going on? And so that's one thing that we've been trying to tease out over these last couple of winters when we learn that the population at Idaho has crashed. So I want to back up a little bit to talk about why count winter birds. And my thinking about this has changed over the years. As in my 20s, I focused on my focus was Harlequin ducks, and I counted birds because I needed to figure out about the Harlequin duck winter population. But my thinking on this has changed over the years. It's looking back, there's been huge changes in the birds that I find on these winter counts. And I'm grateful that I collected data on all the species I ran across. But I really, 90% of the work that I do currently, the work we do at Maine Natural History Observatory, I really consider that we're working for the next generation of biologists. And we know that change has happened over the last 40 years and know that more change is coming over the next 40 to 50 years and longer. And I see some of the best thing that we can do is collect data and archive it in a way that it can be repeated in the future. And that to be our primary focus of all research projects. Of like, okay, we've got some questions on Harlequin ducks, numbers are shifting. It's like, okay, let's collect first priority, collect it in a way that it's going to be useful in 50 years and answer that question at the same time, and maybe some other questions. So I shifted around as I really think think of it as working for the next generation of biologists as the highest priority. And, working for the species as well. These are the species we ran across most on those surveys, um, those offshore winter surveys. And some of these populations have changed drastically in the last 40 years, and others just a little bit. Others might be fairly stable, haven't changed that much. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of biologists, they focus their research on, the questions too much of like, I'm just, answer a question, write a paper on it, and they're advancing science. And I think of, collect data, archive it. I'm advancing science that way. If I can answer some questions at the same time, that's so much the better. So I want to focus down on this area east of Isle Ho, and all these pins on the map are locations that we've been to count winter water birds and A9, a bunch of surveys in this area, east of Isle Ho, between Isle Ho and this is Marshall Island off to the northeast a little bit. So in that area, I've extracted 34 surveys, December through March, and 27 of those surveys were in the 1980s and 1990s. And again, I'm still extracting data. I don't have everything. I've got another month or two of getting all the data compiled. But I wanted to, for the purpose of this talk, show some results on what our current knowledge is. So I figured I'd summarize the surveys that I've extracted so far. And I'm going to be showing some maps, and there's two terms I'm going to use when on the maps. And one is a keystone site. And a keystone site is a location that consistently supports a large percentage of the population of a species on, on most counts in that area. So that's one term I'm going to use. The other is a consistent site. Those are the sites that regularly support birds of a species, but they aren't dominating the total. So they're the next tier of important sites. And so you'll see, I'm going to show a series of maps for a lot of these species. And the keystone and consistent sites will be mapped on these as well. So I want to orient you first on what's going on, because we're going to look at these same maps for a whole bunch of different species. And so this is all winter water birds, regardless of species. So this is the area east of Isle Ho. This is Isle Ho off on this side. Marshall Island is up here. Stonington would be up and off the screen. And I've clustered the data for multiple islands. So I've made 4 clusters of data that I summarized bird numbers in. So the Spoons and the York Island area, the Fog Island area, and the Marshall Island area. And in the green circle is the average count among those 34 December through March counts. So we had, 900, an average of 900 water birds of all species in this area on these counts up through 1989 through 2002. 561 here on Fog Island, 558 on the Spoons, and not as many, like 211 off York Island. With the keystone sites mapped as stars and consistent sites mapped as blue crosses. So you can get an idea. If you understand how to read this map, it'll make it easier reading the others. There's one other bit I want to point out, and that's we did a very simple linear regression on the data as well. So I entered in a few more recent surveys up through 2026 of this area, and just did a simple, well, has there been any significant changes in the population? And, just in terms of across all species, there has been a decline in the number of birds we've run across in this region since 1989. So the most common bird historically in this area that we ran across was the common eider. And this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone if you were birding a few decades ago in winter. The common eider used to be quite common. You'd see flocks of 100, 200, 300 regularly on winter surveys. And I did assess again with a very simple linear regression, just looked at trends in each of these locations. And so if it has this red down arrow is saying this had an average of 167 common eiders in this island cluster, 1989 to 2002. And if you compare it to the recent surveys, that's a significant decline that's happening in this area. And all of these sites have had significant declines, which isn't surprising. You rarely run across many eider on these surveys anymore. The black scoter was the second most common species historically in this area. It was declining in the Fog Island area, holding its own on these others, but we're going to do some more sophisticated modeling, trend modeling. So I suspect as we get the data analyzed, we're going to be able to tease out more of these trends. And the other thing to point out is we're really focused in on just a subset of the coast in this core area. But our trend analysis is going to be much broader, looking at the whole coast and see what's happening in the larger picture. But focus down in, it's like, well, it's black scoter numbers have declined significantly there. Again, it's, for the region as a whole, it's showing declines in that species. The Harlequin duck. Now, this is an interesting one to look at. We're showing our first significant increase in population here in this group of islands off of Marshall Island. Numbers there are going up. No significant declines or increases here, except this Spoons area and the York Island area. Those numbers are going down, just not significant using a simple linear regression. So this has me a little worried that we're showing some declines in the Harlequin here. Increases there. Is, that enough to offset, all the birds that we lost at Isle Ho that maybe we're losing some here as well. We still need to tease that out and figure that out. But, slightly encouraging to see some increases with the Harlequin. The trend is showing increases as well for this zoomed in cluster of the coast, but there's still more to figure out what's going on with the Harlequin. And the purple sandpiper was the next most abundant species that we run crossed historically in this area. Um, Significant decline in the York Island area. And again, we're focused in on a particular core section of the coast. It's like we know that this species is declining on the coast quite significantly. And Elliot, who's on this call, has been rerunning surveys for the last few winters, trying to get a better handle on that decline and whether, make sense of what's happening regionally with that. So it's, looking at the whole coast, it is a declining species that went through a bottleneck 15 years ago, population bottleneck. But focused in on this region, it's, a significant decline just in one of these little island clusters. And now we'll get to um, the less common species. Great cormorants is, we run across fewer of those in winter. Significant declines on the spoons and horses, and this makes sense. We've been tallying the number of bald eagles we see in winter on these offshore islands, and those have been going up significantly in this area. So it would make sense that the cormorants would make easy prey for the bald eagles, and they might want to split that area. The long-tailed duck is interesting. Before I did this quick analysis, I was thinking back to all these offshore winter surveys and saying, well, if there's one species that hasn't changed in the last 4 decades, it's long-tailed. They don't winter offshore. I rarely get them at Isle Ho, rarely get them out here on the spoons. So it's more of a close to the mainland species up in the bays, that where you mostly find them. And we're getting some declines up here, which I was not expecting to see. So not sure what's going on with that species. And the black guillemot is, overall showing some minor declines. Nothing significant in the island clusters, but this is a species with some stuff going on with it. Elliot, who's on this call, is starting a research project looking more at black guillemot's breeding season. I don't know if he's going to do any winter work as well, but there's some concern about the black guillemots in Maine. And getting down to the last two species, the red-breasted merganser, not much change. The biggest change we're seeing is out at the spoons and horses with a decline, maybe related to the bald eagles out there. And the last is the common loon, which is an interesting one that I'd forgot how rare these were to see historically on these offshore sites. It's an average of one in all these island clusters for up through 2002. And for recent surveys, the common loons have just been all over the place for some winters, but then other winters, the numbers are low. And so it's a complex species. I think, depending on the winter, they might winter on the Maine coast, they might winter elsewhere. So the numbers are fluctuating around a little bit. I think it's an increasing population with the complexity that it's wintering. It doesn't always winter in the same places. So I've learned a ton about offshore work on all these trips, and it hasn't just been me running these surveys. There's a lot of really competent folks also running surveys. Elliot and Logan currently running a whole bunch of surveys. And even historically, John Drury on Vinyl Haven has run a ton of surveys in winter. And some fishermen at Isle Ho, Dave Hiltz and Greg Runge, were been a huge help with the Harlequin Duck work and purple sandpiper work over the years and survey efforts. So it's there's been a lot of players contributing to all this effort. It's not just me, but I was initially quite timid of working offshore, but you got to pick your days and be flexible when when the weather changes and learn how to dress. That's that's the biggest thing. If you once you learn how to dress to stay warm, it can be pleasant out there even when the temperature is quite chilly. And you get to see wonderful places like this. It's Saddleback Ledge. It's a fairly offshore ledge between Vinyl Haven and Isle of Ho. Not a lot of people get out there. You got to take a long boat ride to go see it. Um, but you get out there in the dead of winter, and it's like, well, what am I going to see? It's maybe this side of the ledge is maybe there's nothing, but then on the other side, maybe there's a flock of 50 harlequins or some other cluster of birds that you know that just aren't picked up by most birders working on the coast. And same with an island like this. If you get a calm enough day to get out there, it's like, I wonder what birds call this place home. I love that aspect of all of these surveys. And sometimes the counting is really easy. It's flat, calm. The birds stay put. They don't move around a lot. You can just scan through and get your counts and move along. That's not always the case. It's maybe this is as close as you can get to the cow pens. This flock of purple sandpipers, and they're tucked over the ledge, but you can't get over to the other side because, it's too rough over there or too many ledges. And you're in a bouncing boat and trying to get a good count. It can be challenging. And that's where having more eyes, more participants, keeping track of birds that fly or trying to get an accurate count when, birds are disappearing behind waves and whatnot. So yeah, there's definitely plenty of help that we need on these surveys. It's, the more eyes, the better for detecting species, but also we really don't want to double count species. So as birds fly around, we need folks to keep track of, where they fly to, so we don't double count them. And so on most of these trips, we had multiple observers um, on them. And, you run across great photos like this every once in a while, close-ups of Harlequin ducks. You can hear them squeaking. They make a really interesting call. But it always makes my day whenever I see a Harlequin duck off the Maine coast, see a purple sandpiper, can really make my day kind of anytime, any time of year. So for those of you who are going with on tomorrow's trip, um, it's a huge help. The most expensive part of all of this work is the boat, getting the boat, hiring the boat to take us out there. And so by coming along on the trip and helping to fund the platform, the boat platform, allows us to get out there and collect some more data points, which is a huge help. And if you know, can't join us tomorrow, or, we sold out our tickets fairly quickly for that boat trip. So if you weren't able to join on this trip, we hope to be running more of these in future years, future winters. But you can also become a member of Maine Natural History Observatory that supports this work, allows us to hire the boats to get out to these areas and keep collecting this important data and archiving it in a way that the next generation of folks can use it as well. as well as us. I'm sure the questions are going to change in another 50 years, and hopefully it's data that we're collecting and archiving. So that's what I have for the talk. And so I'm not sure if any questions have come in while I've been chatting. But Elliot, is there?
Yeah, I can let's see, we've got a few comments and then the most recent questions from Lance, which says, I can recall seeing many hundreds of common eiders off the Scudic Peninsula in late December about 25 years ago. What's happening with that species there now?
Yeah, no, it's totally crashed. There was maybe a decade because yeah, I have the same memory. I've been going through my field notebooks. It's like I threw around 200 eider just like candy in my field notebook. It just there were too many to count, and so you estimate by hundreds. And then there was a good decade and a half around the early 2000s where I don't think I saw a flock of over 25 eider. They just really crashed. Um, Very noticeable. And then in the last 10 years or so, numbers have been coming up. I have seen a flock of 300. It made me excited that, it's been a while since I'd seen that. But still numbers are quite down across the board. It kind of makes sense. They're so tied to blue mussels, and really the blue mussels have really changed drastically. All bivalves have really at these sites. And so yeah, them and the black scoter, we're seeing the biggest, most drastic change.
Whoops, I was muted there. We've got a question from Robert. Are drones being used for offshore surveys?
Yeah, they aren't yet. And I could see how it may be useful. Um, well, maybe I don't know enough about technology. How far, how far off could you fly a drone to do a count, to do video of a site? Um, but no, I don't know of folks using it yet for counting wintering water birds. Um, at least we haven't in Maine yet. Um, there's potential, but there's also a lot of logistics involved with that. Um, so I don't think we're quite there yet of me wanting to jump in and really try that. I think we could get there where it's really gonna make counting really change the face of counting at some point. I don't quite think we're there yet.
Craig is wondering what your longitudinal data might point to from the stance of advocacy.
Um, yeah, I guess I don't fully understand the question. Do you understand what he's asking, Elliot, or should we
Maybe just
unmute
like
him?
the time series of, almost 4 decades of data, from a perhaps a policy or advocacy standpoint, what your data are pointing to over 40 years.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's one I struggle with is there's a lot of change. Um, and sometimes, eiders and mussels, it's like you kind of know you can puzzle together what's going on. Um, Harlequins, it's like, well, otter, I think, are driving some weird shifts in the population. Purple sandpipers, not really sure. Maybe it's happening up on breeding grounds. Maybe it's food based. Maybe it's predator based. Maybe it's a mix of all those. And so to try to think about policy in light of all those bits of knowledge that kind of shift from species to species, it's like I leave that to to the experts and policymakers. It's like I like to focus on the change and explain why, if I can. And those are really complex questions, and not the management with the big M. My focus is on the birds.
Related question from Ingrid. Can you tell if the food sources for the Harlequin ducks have decreased? Is that related to the ducks' decline?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was back in the late 1990s. I did a food study, collected a whole bunch of samples in the areas where Harlequin ducks were feeding. And there was a whole lot of bivalves and gastropods, tiny things mixed in Mastocarpus stellatus, which is a seaweed with really lumpy, gnarly seaweed. And this tiny little couple-inch square collection of seed, pull off their millimeter or 2 millimeter or 3 millimeter inverts off of it, bivalves and gastropods. I haven't repeated that work, but I've gone to ledges and picked up this seaweed in places and pawed through it, and I just can't find the invertebrates that I used to. I haven't repeated it at the same locations using the same methods, so it's I don't I don't know if that's just an artifact. I'm looking in the wrong places until I go back and repeat it to really know. And if they're having trouble with their prey base, it should also show up in uh, their feeding rates. Um, and so that could be looked at as well. We've got good data on historic feeding rates from back in the 90s, but no one's done that yet. So I don't have a hunch that there's a huge change there. I think they're finding enough to eat. Maybe the prey base has shifted slightly, but this is all just guessing. I really don't know.
Question from Logan. You described purple sandpiper as having gone through a bottleneck within the last 15 years. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, do you want to
Oh,
expand on
I
that?
don't know,
Or
Glenn. You've been at this a lot longer
I
than
know
I
it's our transition where it's like, so I did this is with Lindsay at Maine Fish and Wildlife, Lindsay Tudor. It was back in the early 2000s. We surveyed most of the coast to try to get an estimate for the population of purple sandpipers. And we did, in some areas of the coast, we had um, a lot of data to generate that number. And as we repeated some of those surveys, there was at some point around, I forget one, 2010-ish or something, that the numbers just weren't there that we were seeing historically. And she set up a monitoring survey, and that's one that Elliot is still using to monitor purple sandpipers and the population. But it really what we're finding is on the mid coast, the numbers have about cut in half. We lost 50% of the population that winters in Maine sometime around the 2010-ish area. And we've looked down east. I think you've been doing some of those surveys as well, Elliot, looking at our sites down east. We're like, well, maybe it's just the mid coast and something going on here. So we repeated the surveys locations that we had done down east, and those were also showing a 50% drop in numbers. So, and I call it a bottleneck because I think it appears to be a short period. We weren't sampling right when that happened. So it's, I forget the exact number of years, but it's within a 5-year period, maybe a little more, when we lost 50% and don't really know why yet.
We haven't fully crunched the numbers, but they seem similar in these most recent surveys to the mid 2010s. And so, there might have been that bottleneck, and then they've sort of sustained the numbers since then. Um,
Yeah, that's my impression as well. It's with the surveys I've been on. It's like they don't seem to be continuing to drop. They just went through some bottleneck. It's but it shows up in the flock sizes. You used to see flock sizes averaging up near 100 birds or something. Seeing a flock of 300, 500 was fairly commonplace in winter. This was historically, and recently see a flock of 100 purple sandpipers, and that's unusual these days. You're more often to run across really small flock sizes.
Question from Ted. He says, in regards to the otters being a possibility of lower numbers of harlequins, are there any other surveys along the coast that may show an increase elsewhere?
Yeah, for harlequins, definitely. So I showed that map that showed uh, it showed 1,100 Harlequin ducks on the coast, with 1,000 in the mid coast and 50 along the down east coast and 50 in southern Maine. So the down east coast is that population has been increasing in size and also in distribution as well. So that's an increasing population. Um, Maybe it's last time I was looking at it, maybe 200, 250 Harlequins in that portion of the coast when there used to be just, 50 or 60. Um, and I'm not sure what's happening in southern Maine, Cape Nettic. That's kind of a small site. I think of it as being stable, but or declining very slightly. But I haven't been keeping an eye on that population.
I've got one quick question, and then maybe do you want to talk logistics for tomorrow? Um,
Yeah.
so my question is around non-avian changes. You've obviously spent so much time on the coast at all these sites, and the talk today was a lot about birds, and you did mention some of the invertebrate stuff just anecdotally, but just from being out at these sites, like landscape stuff, or the vegetation, or what have you. What have you noticed since the late '80s changing or staying the same?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I didn't when I started out as a 20-some-year-old starting out, I didn't think I'd witness change or even change was a thing. I don't know why I thought that, but um I did. Uh but I see it would take a little bit to explain. So I study plants out on islands, particularly on the down east coast, winter water birds out on islands down east coast, breeding seabirds. I've been part of some tracking of those over the last few decades and changes. And there is a lot of changes. And the thing I'm seeing is the changes seem to be happening the further east you get. The down east coast, we're seeing the greatest changes. Um, and not in a good way. It's, declines in breeding seabirds, changes in uh, plants on islands. Um, there's some it's an it's an it can be a kind of an Arctic environment, Arctic-like environment on the down east coast. It's tied to the cold water current that comes in from around Nova Scotia, part of the Labrador current. And that's changing. The Gulf of Maine is warming rather rapidly. And so I'm seeing a bunch of changes down east in terms of seabirds, in terms of breeding seabirds, in terms of otter mink populations. Those are increasing down east, out on offshore islands. Vegetation wise, I think we're losing some of the the species that are tied to the more colder Arctic climate. I think I'm seeing some of those start to disappear. Um, with the Maine Bird Atlas, we saw the biggest decline in breeding birds compared to the first breeding bird atlas, that the biggest decline in the whole state in terms of species diversity of breeding birds was on the down east coast. And it's a reason why I'm focusing a lot of work on the far down east coast, because we're seeing a lot of change already, and I'm expecting to see even more change there. The most drastic change we see in Maine, I think, is going to be along that down east coast. And yeah, I've witnessed some of it with all the field work over the years, and there's definitely more headed our way.
Well, thanks, Glenn. Yeah, I guess I'll turn it over to you for talking logistics tomorrow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we're doing for those of you who are joining us tomorrow, we're going to this area that I was showing on the maps. Leaving out of Stonington. The plan is for folks to arrive there at try to arriving at 9:30. The boat leaves at 10. If we can assemble a little quicker, we might go out earlier, but if it takes a while, if you're delayed, it's like we'll wait. I've got a list of who we're supposed to be showing up at the boat. So if you're late, don't worry. We won't leave before 10. Um, but yeah, if we can, we might try to get out of there a little earlier if folks can assemble early. So shoot to get there at 9:30. And we're on the Idaho ferry boat. So it does have a cabin with glass around the sides. The cabin is heated. The boat, I haven't talked with the captain to know if the head is working. So sometimes it has a working bathroom. Other times they suggest use the bathrooms at the ferry dock rather than in the boat. So we'll have to ask them when we arrive if there's a working head on the boat. So the cabin is heated. Um, there's a place out back where you get better visibility for counting. And there's also a door next to where the captain stands. When we're doing counting, I may swing that open. I like to stay up near the captain so I can direct him where we want to go. So I often do my counting from there. And having that door open does cool the cabin down a little bit. So it's not like it's always going to be really cushy and warm in there, thanks to me for opening the door and closing the door. And so the way I envision it is I'm going to be counting what I see up, standing next to the captain, looking out that door. It's kind of, you know, in a sense, I may be keeping a separate list from everyone else because I think a bulk of the folks, I envision Logan being in the back running the master list. I think he's probably going to be e-birding the list and breaking it up and so that the species lists are island specific. That's how we need the data recorded. Um, and Elliot, I envision to be the one kind of keeping track of what people are seeing, in a sense, helping to direct the master list. I don't know if Elliot may be recording the paper list, the official paper list of the thing, and Logan can simultaneously be putting it up on eBird as well as the secondary list. But in terms of what folk can do to help, there is a lot that we need help with. So if you're comfortable being part of all of this, the more eyes, the better. So, either in the cabin, there's a lot of glass, or out in the back as we get to islands, helping us detect species, um, getting a good count of them. It's going to be some waves out there. So it means that the flock of birds might be visible for a second and then it goes behind a wave, and the counting is going to be challenging. And we count all species. And so the more eyes we have looking and detecting and getting a good count and talking among ourselves, it's like, I saw 12 harlequins and, oh, I saw 14 at one point. That's all useful information. The other bit that's useful is keeping track of where birds fly to. So we don't want to double count birds if birds fly away from the shoreline that we're counting on. If they fly to an area that we already counted, it's like, don't need to pay attention. They're going someplace we've already done. It's when they fly to an area that we haven't counted yet. It's like, oh, that we got to keep track of that. And that's challenging as well. So on these surveys, if I have enough observers, I tend to have everyone kind of helps detect. But as soon as birds start flying, it's like I want one or two people just keeping track of that for us on the group. And so we can do the same as well. And it's just a matter of talking through where the birds have gone. And, I think Elliot and Logan are the point people with bird numbers. I think they're likely going to be out back, out of the cabin doing the counting, and I'm going to be up in the cabin up near the front. But I'm more concerned that they have the good data, that they get everything tallied. And I may be doing my own stuff up front, tallying as well, and I can compare lists with them later. It's just hard if I want to keep running back and forth to the captain and to Logan and Elliot in the back. So I'll compare notes with them later. And if you're not comfortable, if you're just there for coming along on the ride, that's fine. Can stay put in the cabin. And we'll get good looks of ducks, I'm sure. We'll likely run across, it's we're not quite billing this as a sightseeing trip or a birding trip. It's a research trip to get numbers. And so if we get a couple of harlequins, fairly close by in a protected site, we're not likely going to linger so everyone can get good views and get photos and the best photo and everything. It's, what we'll do is we'll try to get a good count and then move on. And that approach often, it's not like it means we're going to see less. We're going to see more. And there's even going to be more opportunity, maybe closer birds that we run across, or a flock of 100 harlequins. Have any of you ever seen that? We may run across that, fairly close, all squeaking, flying by the boat. It's, in a sense, you're more likely to run across things like that the more ground you cover. And so that's going to be the name of the game tomorrow. So was texting with the captain. The wind's supposed to come up in the afternoon. We think it'll be okay tomorrow. We've decided to give it a try and go. When we only have 2 days to choose from, you can't be too picky on weather conditions. So I think it's going to be good enough for us to go. and we'll probably go to I'm not sure where yet. I gotta check the weather conditions tomorrow, but we might head out to like the Spoons and Horses first. That's the most offshore site, and then move up in the bay. So if it gets windy, it's easier to tuck in behind things. And, you know, if it gets windy, it's going to be later in the day. So I think, we're supposed to get back to the dock at 1, and I think that's when the wind will really be piping up. So that's good timing. We'll be off the water by then. Any other questions come in?
Uh, Not about tomorrow. We did have one more question about. I know we're over, but Lance did have one question about Eastern versus Western Harlequin ducks, and if they're, um, genetically distinct or pretty different.
Yes. Yeah, no, we contributed to that effort. So there was a genetics paper done on that, and it was collaborating with the Pacific Harlequin duck researchers and the Atlantic Harlequin duck researchers, and it was looking at morphometrics, and I think there was some genetics involved as well. And it wasn't finding the differences that we were expecting, that a lot of the researchers were expecting. Um, and so that paper got published, and it kind of it fizzled some of the conservation efforts and concerns from on this side of the Atlantic. Um, and I'm not sure. I don't know. I'd have to revisit that paper now that I've got more knowledge of genetics to see if there's anything there worth teasing out some more. Oh yeah, Lance is asking about tracking. We actually implanted satellite tags in Harlequins. These were male Harlequins. So we implanted them in March. Um, they went up to their breeding grounds. So this was what, 6 or 8 Harlequin duck males that we did. And those birds bred on Gaspé Peninsula and southern Quebec. And as soon as the eggs go down for the pair on the river, the male splits from the female and does its own thing. They actually meet up again on the wintering grounds. So the males and females are apart for most of the summer. And so they bred the males went up the river, presumably eggs went down, the males split for the coast, and half of the males molted off the Gannet Islands, which is off the Labrador coast, and the other half flew over to Greenland, southern Greenland, and molted over there. So that's termed a molt migration. And we were able to re-find all 8 of those birds back in Maine the next winter. So that helped to show that it was a molt migration. But it was an unknown connection at the time, which we didn't realize that there was a connection with Greenland with the birds that winter in Maine. And I think it's just some of them. The females molt at a different time of year, so they raise the broods, they get down to the coast, then they molt later in the summer. I've seen some molting on birds at Isle Ho in early winter. So their molt is timed completely differently. But yeah, we did a fair bit of tracking on those a couple decades ago.
Right. Seems like maybe we're wrapping up here. Unless there's more questions that have gone past that I haven't seen. I think we're caught up on questions. So yeah. I think we're done. Thank you so much, everyone who joined us tonight.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And for some of you, we'll see you on the boat tomorrow and get a chance to see what birds are still there compared to what was there a couple decades ago.